But I really am delighted to be here. First of all, my gosh, look outside that window. Those beautiful mountains, that blue, blue sky, the green of the trees. What a beautiful environment. And second of all, I'm grateful for Utah Global Diplomacy, right? What an amazing institution that has stood in this place doing these good things for so many years. I'm grateful also to hear of the Bellwether organization, which is doing such great work. And the speakers so far have been absolutely terrific. So we really are being richly fed today, and not just with pasta. So I'm here today to kind of give an overview that I think many of our speakers have already touched on, is that there's some sort of very interesting relationship between what's going on with women and what's going on with issues of war, peace, development, and so forth. Now, let's see if I know how to work this. Aha, it works. Okay, this will be good. This will be fantastic. All right, so I want to tell you, I'm an academic. I'm just warning you that I'm going to be talking about data and things of this nature, but I promise to do so gently. So, and if you have any questions about anything I said, you can just pop your hand up and I'd be happy to address them. So our main question has been at the Women's Stats Project for quite a few years is there a relationship between the situation, status, and security of women on the one hand, and the stability, resilience, and security of the nations in which they live? And I'm sure everybody in this audience would say, well, sure. But you heard Dr. Benoon this morning. That attitude that, women's issues are just pet rocks weighing down our rucksack, that's real. And it does permeate government, and it does permeate those who are tasked with national security issues. It's seen as a nice little cherry on top. And if you don't have the cherry on top, oh, well, that's okay. And we would like to suggest that it's something much more than that. Now, I think the rhetoric is there. So here's a few really good quotes. We have Ambassador Chowdhury, who actually chaired the Security Council when UN Security Council Resolution 1325 that mandated a women, peace, and security agenda was passed in the year 2000. And he said, we should remember that without peace, development is impossible. And without development, peace is not achievable. But without women, neither peace nor development is possible. I've also seen it, here's one of the former deputy administrators of USAID who came out and spoke to us at Texas A&M. Compare those societies that respect women and those which don't. Who's trafficking in weapons and drugs? Who's harboring terrorists and starting pandemics? Whose problems require U.S. troops on the ground? There's a one-to-one correspondence. Don't tell me there's no relationship between national security and the empowerment of women, all right? People are noticing. The rhetoric is there. There's more to notice, all right? If you delve into the research literature, as I have, many important dimensions of national security are provably linked to the situation of women. So I'd like to just go through a few of those here today with you. So for example, let's talk about food security in women, right? Women produce most of the world's food. In sub-Saharan Africa, women perform 80% of agricultural labor and about 50% of all agricultural labor worldwide. But worldwide, women own less than 20% of farmland. Those children's caloric intake is highly correlated with their mother's property rights. The FAO calculated that if women farmers were given the same assistance as men, malnutrition would drop 17% globally. Remuneration for cash crops is often given to the men who own the land, despite the fact that we have a plethora of studies showing that 95% of a woman's earnings go to her family, while only 40 to 60% of a man's earnings go to his family. Women are expected to process and cook food, find fuel and potable water on top of all their other responsibilities for children and agricultural work. Truly a triple day. But 2/3 of all malnourished children are female children. 70% of the world's hungry are female. And in many societies, women and girl children are expected to eat last and eat a lot less protein. In many agricultural societies, it's women who are responsible to see that women and children do not starve. Men may find it deeply culturally shameful to help them, and so don't assist them with agricultural labor, even though studies have shown that men who help their wives have larger agricultural yields. So the question that we see there at the bottom, I think, is a very apt one. Might inequitable treatment of women make famine and malnutrition more likely for a country? And the answer is absolutely yes. The linkages are there. We know these linkages. The same can be said for economic prosperity in women. There's a variety of really terrific studies on this. A series of studies use something called the gender gap. So the greater the gap, the worse the situation of women. The smaller the gap, the better the situation of women. So the larger the gender gap, the lower the GDP per capita of a nation, and the lower the rate of national economic growth. I mean, that is such a significant finding that you can usually use it in Statistics 101 classes because it reliably yields such an incredible correlation coefficient. Lower investment in female education is linked to lower national income. Economic development projects with a gender component are more successful than those without. And in 2015, McKinsey & Company put forth a simulation in which they looked at scenarios in which women participate in the economy identically to men. And what they found is that would add up to $28 trillion to annual global GDP. And this impact is roughly equivalent to the size of the combined Chinese and US economies today. So when we talk about economic prosperity as a dimension of national security, is the situation and status of women related to that? Yes, absolutely. How could it not be, right? They're half of the population. Health in women. This one is a lot more intuitive for people because providing health care for a family is usually a highly gendered task. It's usually tasked to women to assure the health of their families. And so, again, we are not surprised by findings that say the smaller the gender gap, the lower the infant and child mortality rate. The smaller the gender gap, the lower the level of child malnutrition. The smaller the gender gap, the lower the share of household income spent on cigarettes and alcohol. The larger the gender gap, the higher the AIDS rate. The larger the gender gap, the higher the infectious disease burden. The larger the gender gap, the lower the life expectancy, not just for women, but also for men. So does inequitable treatment of women make poor health for the country more likely? A burden on the nation? Yeah, absolutely. Again, how could it not? There's so many linkages that you'd have to be blind not to see them. Now, my bailiwick is looking at conflict in women, and there's now a burgeoning literature that shows that countries that mistreat their women are also countries that are far more likely to find themselves in conflict. So, for example, the higher the level of violence against women, it's been found the more likely a nation state is to be non-compliant with international norms. No surprise there. I think of Dr. Benoon's speech on Afghan women this morning. I mean, absolutely. The Taliban, non-compliant with international norms, yes. And the less peacefully the nation state will behave in an overall sense in the international system. But also, the mistreatment of women is correlated with higher levels of state fragility, lower political stability, and a higher incidence of terrorist acts. And we're going to explore some of this a little bit later. The higher the level of violence against women, the worse a nation-state's relations with its neighboring countries. The larger the gender gap, the more likely a nation-state is to be involved in both inter- and intrastate conflict and to be the state that uses violence first in such conflicts. Survey analysis also shows that individuals possessing gender unequal beliefs are significantly more hostile towards other nations and even minority groups within their own nation. Isn't that interesting that misogyny sets a template for hatred of the other across all sorts of levels? And of course, my own work has shown that when you cull girls from the birth population, it actually destabilizes nations. I also have work that shows bride price can destabilize nations. So a variety of things that we think of as sort of customary or cultural practices that in fact can be shown empirically to destabilize nations. So does inequitable treatment of women make conflict more likely for your nation state? Yes, yes it does. Governance in women is a wonderful area that there's been some significant new research in showing that the larger the gender gap, the higher the levels of perceived and actual government corruption. The lower the effectiveness rating of the government, the World Bank's governance effectiveness indicators, and the lower the rule of law indices. The smaller the gender gap, on the other hand, the greater the level of trust in government and the greater the transparency of government. Studies have also shown that when the representation of women in decision-making councils is higher, more attention, that is a greater number of pieces of legislation, concern social welfare, fighting corruption, and improving legal protections for citizens. And I'm sure you all know that when women are involved in peace negotiations, the outcome of the negotiations, the treaty concluded, is far more durable, lasting significantly longer than if women are excluded. So does inequitable treatment of women make poor governance more likely for your country? Yes, absolutely. Demographics in women, well, you know, that one's pretty intuitive too, but we need to speak about it for a moment. What we find is that when marriage is highly inequitable between men and women, we usually get unsustainably high levels of population growth, right? And you can still see this today. But when society makes it economically irrational for women to have children by punishing mothers in the workplace, such as we see in nations such as Japan, but I would argue also the United States, sub-replacement birth rates often result. And now we have over 90 nations of the world with sub-replacement birth rates. And the refrain that I hear over and over again is our government wants us to reproduce, but they don't want us to be mothers, right? Or our government wants us to reproduce, but they also want to punish us and exclude us from the workforce. And then lastly, the overall global sex ratio, of course, is unbalanced now. In a non-altered population, natural population, you would expect to see overall sex ratios of about 98 men per 100 women, because women, as you know, live longer than men do on average. However, our global overall sex ratio is now between 101 and 102 men per 100 women. And this was not caused by any type of natural disaster or plague. This is man-made. This is entirely man-made. This is the culling of girls from the birth populations in a wide variety of nations. So women are not the canary. And what I mean by this is that oftentimes when I give this type of presentation, someone will say, but Professor Hudson, it's really lack of democracy or poverty that's causing the maltreatment of women. And I say, why do you believe so? I believe that it's the maltreatment of women that causes poverty and that causes all of these other issues such as instability and lack of democracy. I think you've got it backwards, right? The canary used to be the little canary the miners would bring into the mine. And as you know, oxygen can, in an unsuspecting way, disappear while you're in a mine. And so if the little canary keeled over, they knew that the miners had to escape. So the canary is sort of like a tripwire warning you there's something wrong with the mine. But I say women are not the canary in the coal mine. It is the character of male-female relations in our world that is the coal mine from which oxygen is being depleted. The canaries, right, are conflict, ill health, lack of economic prosperity, poor health, poor governance, right? All of these things, those are the canaries that are telling you that there is a problem between the men and the women in your world. I think my very favorite quote of Hillary Clinton's was one that she gave back in 2012 when she was Secretary of State. And she said, "The subjugation of women is a threat to the common security of our world and to the national security of our country." And that is absolutely, positively right. And I can show that with my own research. We've tried to write a number of books that lay this out in a more formal fashion, mustering evidence as well as stories from around the world. So Sex and World Peace was sort of our big summary of this argument. Originally we were going to call it Sex and Peace, but then our publisher told us it sounded too much like a massage manual. So we called it Sex and World Peace. And it's used in many, many classrooms, not just in the United States, but in other nations, to attempt to, in a sense, raise the consciousness of students at the university level, that it's not just some sort of politically correct, empty rhetorical thing to say that what's going on with women affects national security, but it is in fact absolutely real. So the book is organized around what we call the three wounds, right? The wounds that are suffered by women in the household of those who should have been their friends. And those wounds include the physical insecurity of women, of which there are so many dimensions, it's impossible to cover. Secondly, inequitable family law that favors men. Just to give you an example, in some countries, women do not have full citizenship rights. They cannot pass their citizenship on to their children. And if they marry a man who is not a citizen of their country, they lose their citizenship. But there's also many other things, such as extremely unfair divorce laws, where it's very quick for a man to divorce his wife, but takes immense effort and having to prove all sorts of things for a woman to divorce her husband. And then in many societies, children are seen as the property of their husbands and his family, and so custody is never given to the wife. I mean, there's so many things in family law that we could talk about as well. And then, of course, lack of parity in the councils of human decision-making. Study after study shows that the best, most creative, most communitarian decisions are made by mixed-sex groups. Okay? I dare you. Go Google it. You'll find it. And yet, how many of our councils at the highest level of our government don't include women at all? Or there's only a token one or two? How are we supposed to have good decisions for humanity, right, if we lack parity in the councils of human decision-making? I also wrote a book called The Hillary Doctrine, because I realized nobody else was writing it, darn it. And so if anybody was going to do it, it would have to be me. That's a really bad way of attacking a book, but that's the way I attacked it, was that no one was writing this book, which is, what did Hillary Clinton do as Secretary of State during those 4 years that 4.5, that she was Secretary of State? She went in with the idea that women mattered. She really really believes that, as I do. What was she able to accomplish? What was she not able to accomplish? And so that was extremely eye-opening for me, because I did dozens and dozens of interviews and discovered what she was up against, right? What she was really up against in attempting to get the government, which is not monolithic at all, to care about women. And this was a very painful journey for her, I believe. There's many, many quandaries. So I would like to mention, I'm getting old now, and at some point you have to decide what your magnum opus is, and I think this is the one. Which is called The First Political Orders, How Sex Shapes Governance and National Security Worldwide. Now, I have had a bunch of animations in the PowerPoint, and the first few were not working. So these were very animation-dependent slides I'm about to give you, so they may not work. So, but I'll just try to talk through it anyway, all right? Well, let's just do it. Let's see if it'll work or not. Nope. Okay. All right, the animations are not working. And now it won't let me go back. Aha, there we go. All right, the animations aren't working. All right. What we say, and this is not something that people have never said before, is that the first political order in any society is the sexual political order, okay? It is the relationship between the two halves of humanity. And if those two halves do not cooperate, there is no next round of the game. The game ends. And in fact, I'm willing to argue that women are voting that the game ends by what we're seeing with worldwide fertility rates so far. So I asked my students, if you had to create a video game where these two groups had to interact with each other for there to be a next round, what would you want to know? And they always ask me political questions. They say, well, how did these groups stand before each other? Are they equals or are they superior and inferior? How are conflicts resolved? Are they resolved by compromise, or are they resolved by one group dominating the other? How are resources allocated? Are they allocated equally, or are things that are valuable, such as food, such as wealth, such as livestock, whatever, is that dominated by one group or another? And I say, yeah, those are all political questions. And now you see why the sexual political order is the first political order. And what we suggest in this book is that there are two primary ways of ensuring group security in the 21st century. States, which are relatively new on the world stage, and something far, far, far older, which is extended male kin networks, clans, tribes, and so forth. And that where states are weak or weakening, these networks resurge as the primary security mechanism in the society. But the creation of these fraternities, if you will, these gangs, these clans, these tribes that all revolve around male kinship and ficto kinship, aggravate the insecurity and instability of the groups they pretend to protect, producing high levels of corruption and instability and government ineffectiveness, asset stripping, extremism, and the constant threat of annihilation. Where should we look to see that order? Well, at first, I thought, well, we'll just look at what we in the field of international relations consider to be the big three indicators. We're going to look at female literacy. We'll look at female labor force participation. And we'll look at female political representation. That's where the action is. But then there was a conversation that I had 15 years ago now. And it was at BYU. And we were hosting women, just a handful of women who had been elected to the Loya Jirga in Afghanistan, because the Americans had put in a quota of 25% women. We never had a quota for our country, so we actually at the time had a fewer percentage of women in Congress than were in the Afghan Loya Jirga, which abounds with ironies. Fortunately, I think we could now claim that we have fulfilled our 25% quota here in the US, but anyhow, so I'm kind of a nerdy, introverted type, and always get tense, and I was assigned to host a particular woman over lunch. And so, again, I was so nervous. I was like, what do I say to her? So I said, Dr. So-and-so, it is so wonderful. Here you are, you're a trained pediatrician, and now you're a member of the Loya Jirga. Look how empowered Afghan women are becoming. And she was like, whoa, Valerie, no, you don't understand. She said, I could go home today, and if my husband said, I divorce you 3 times, I would be divorced. And if he did, I would not have custody of my children, because children are given to their father upon divorce in Afghanistan. And if he divorced me, I'd have nowhere to live, because my father's family wouldn't take me back for the shame of it, and you can't live as a single woman in Kabul or any of the outlying areas as well. She said, even if he doesn't divorce me, I'm going to have very little say over who my children marry or at what age they marry. So she was like, so how empowered am I, Valerie? Really? And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, I've been thinking about this all wrong, right? Where I really need to be looking is the household level, right? Because you can have high female literacy and a very imbalanced situation for women. Saudi Arabia, look up female literacy rates in Saudi Arabia, they're pretty darn high. You can have high female labor force participation and a miserable situation for women. Look at the Philippines, right? You can have high, very high, the highest in the world, female political participation, Rwanda, 61%, and a miserable situation for women. So that's actually not where the action is happening. Where is the action happening? Right there in the home, where there's a woman and a man that has to work out the first political order. And so the questions we need to be asking are questions like, how much say does a woman have about getting married, and how old is she when she is married? How much say does a woman have within her marriage over, say, commitment of resources? What types of property and inheritance rights do women have? Are there inequities in family law, such as in matters of divorce and child custody? Is marriage patrilocal, where the bride moves to the husband's family's compound? Are bride price or dowry paid? Is polygyny or cousin marriage prevalent? Does the society view domestic violence and femicide as normal, even expected, even obligatory? Is rape treated as a property crime against a man? That's where we need to look. We need to look at the first political order. Now, what the next slide would be is a beautiful diagram that shows how all of those things fit together as kind of a bracelet of magnetic beads, almost. That when you have these systematic mechanisms of subordinating women, you get a miserable situation for the nation. But I will tell you that what I say is that these customs, if you will, and practices and laws are actually monstrous. It is a monster that consumes not only women and their children, but men and nation states, right? It is the monster of the subordination of women that is going to produce all of these effects on such as food insecurity, ill health, ill governance, conflict, etc., for the nation state. So what we call this syndrome of subjugating women is really a trap. Governance in the interests of male fraternities is extremely unfortunate. And it will produce instability, violence, terror, corruption, and autocracy because it is built on domestic instability, domestic violence, domestic terror, domestic corruption, and domestic autocracy. Right? It is a template that crosses the levels of analysis from the household to the community to the nation state to the world stage. This is what we see. Also, if there are any aspects of life that depend particularly on women, of course, those will be degraded, right, in such a nation state. So health, which women are often tasked with. Food security, which women are often tasked with. And other types of things as well, such as environmental preservation. All of these things will suffer. So, beyond our wildest hopes, the U.S. Department of Defense gave us $1.5 million to prove what we were saying. And we can have a conversation about what happened when we did this. And so from the years 2014 to 2018, we went out and collected all the possible data we could that looked at the types of practices, customs, and laws that we were interested in. And so we mapped it. I don't think there's any surprises here that some areas of the world have a much worse situation for women. But please don't look at those green areas and think they're wonderful for women. The United States, for example, scored extremely highly on violence against women, whereas they didn't have other things, such as issues of property and inheritance and so forth. How do we see these things? Well, in the book, we talk about how some of these links are immediate and proximate. A great example in this case is bride price. Bride price is the price that the groom's family pays the bride's father to contract the marriage. And this is usually done in cultures where women's labor is highly valuable, such as in sub-Saharan Africa. But bride price often acts as a universal flat regressive tax on young men in the society. There's usually a going rate for a bride. And if you don't have that money, you're out of luck. You are not getting married. At the elite level, of course, there's a lot of flexibility, but there's usually a floor below which you can't go. Bride price, therefore, tends to rise dramatically and in an inflationary sense because every father is looking at every other father. And when one father raises the bride price, another father will raise a bride price, and then it'll go up, 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 up. So there can be dramatic, swift rises in bride price. So surging bride prices, of course, lead to a lot of young men not being able to marry. Rich older men can get married because these societies almost always have practices of polygamy as well. So the rich older men marry up excess women, and the young men go without any brides at all in a society where young men can't become a true man unless he marries and has a son. So you can imagine there's an immense amount of grievance that builds up, and terrorists and guerrilla groups take advantage of this. They will actually recruit young men and say, join us and we'll pay your bride price. Or better yet, join us and we'll kidnap you a bride. And that, of course, is exactly what happened with Boko Haram. And I think it was Professor Benune who referenced the Bring Our Girls Back movement. But the side of the story that the Western media didn't even look at was that these kidnappings were predated by a very swift, incredible rise in bride price that made recruiting into Boko Haram much more attractive for young men. Also not mentioned in the Western press is that when the girls were kidnapped, the group Boko Haram would leave a token bride price on the ground because otherwise the marriages would not be legitimate. So they legitimized it and took the girls. One young lady said, in this crisis, these men can take a wife at no extra charge. Usually it is very expensive to marry, very hard to get a wife, but not now. There's a direct link there between a subordinative practice, bride price, and conflict. And the very same dynamic has been found by scholars who have looked at South Sudan, Pakistan, and Timor-Leste. Now, sometimes the links are longer term and more structural. And here, I'd like to look at the increasing masculinization of the world's sex ratios, which we've talked about now. When I first started researching sex ratios, there were only 5 nations that had abnormal birth sex ratios. But by the time we got to the year 2000, or in 2010, we counted almost 19 countries. And you can see that they're not the ones you're thinking about, China and India, are they? They're places like Albania and Montenegro and Taiwan and Vietnam and Sudan and South Sudan. In addition, masculine migrant flows are also causing dislocations. To give you an excellent example, consider Sweden. In 2015, when we had a huge surge of migrants into Europe, different countries took different tacks. Hungary said, nobody's coming in. Germany said, okay, we're taking 1 million. Sweden said, if you can get to Sweden, we'll take you. And furthermore, if you're under 18 when you come, you will never be deported for any reason, even if you commit a violent crime. So not surprisingly, a whole bunch of migrants went to Sweden. And what Sweden found is they were 85% young adult males. Furthermore, the vast majority of them claimed to be 16 or 17 years old. Not surprising, right? And so when Sweden counted noses the next year in 2016, what they discovered is that their male to female sex ratio in that age group was 123 men for every 100 women. Whereas in China, it was only 117 men per 100 women. So it had far outstripped what China had even done. And if you look now, you will see what effect that had. Sweden went from being one of the most peaceful places on earth to now being actually the gun and bomb capital of Europe in terms of crime. And Sweden has done a volte-face, an about-face, and has now closed borders and is not welcoming anymore. The gendered aspects of this were not considered. Noteworthy is that Canada will not accept unaccompanied young adult males. If the males don't come in a family unit, they're not coming. Of course, Canada has the luxury of the entire Atlantic Ocean, right? But it is interesting to note that Canada realized the gendered implications of an open door to immigration. All right, so there are many, many ramifications. The literature is now vast. Sex ratio alterations increase crime rates and political protest rates. Bribe price surges. Crimes against women surge, which means there's mobility restriction for women in countries with altered sex ratios, either through migration or through female infanticide or sex-selective abortion. STD spread, and maybe even an altered calculus of deterrence. It's pretty hard to deter a nation with 50 million surplus young adult males. It's so much harder to deter them, right? And so when we think about the Taiwan crisis, that's something to keep in mind. Most Western governments are very fearful of attrition warfare. But with altered sex ratios, you may not have to fear attrition warfare at all. Interesting. So many ramifications, but nobody's thinking about altered sex ratios as a national security matter or as something that you should be thinking about when planning for various scenarios over Taiwan. All right, the statistical evidence, I'm not going to totally bore you with it, but the statistical evidence that the Department of Defense paid for was overwhelming, all right? We looked at a wide variety of dimensions. We looked at Well, what if I go back? Can't go back or forward. I don't suppose you have any tech. There we go. All right. We looked at 161 variables. I don't expect you to read that slide, but just know we looked at everything in the kitchen sink. And what we discovered was that in all cases, our measure of what we called the syndrome, which was that subordination of women with the customs and the laws and the practices to support that subordination, was the most determinant and significant variable in our analyses. In fact, over all of our models, 73.8% of those national security indicators were strongly and significantly associated with the treatment of women. And if you want odds, we can give you odds too, right? I won't go over them all because I know time is short, but would you like to be a fragile state? Oppress your women, because with each step that you oppress women, you have twice the chance of being a fragile state, right? 3 times the chance of having a government that is ineffective, autocratic, and more corrupt, and so forth and so on. The odds are just stacked against you. In fact, what I really think, in a sense, is that we can conclude that what you do to your women, you do to your nation state. And if you curse your women, you have cursed your nation state. All of these many indicators of national security will become awful if you subjugate women. That seems almost like an iron law of social science. Rose McDermott, I think she said it well. The findings are clear, consistent, and statistically robust across the board. The results are the kind of thing most social scientists strive for, but almost never find over the course of their careers. If these findings were about something not related to women, chances are they would be treated as revolutionary. Why they're not is anybody's guess. We get these results because, of course, right, the household is the boot camp for the society. And so if you've lived in a domestic autocracy, then a domestic autocracy is what you will want, what you will think is natural. If conflict resolution in that domestic home is by violence, then that's what's seen as justifiable, legitimate, and functional. You start with the first political order, and that is what is going to color the rest of your society. Also, it includes structural instability, such as we talked about with sex ratios and bride price. And lastly, of course, you're disempowering and silencing women, the very people who could argue there's a different way. So oftentimes I'm giving this to this presentation to a national security group that are full of skeptics. And so I usually phrase it this way. I say, listen, in light of what I've given you today, and I remind them the Defense Department paid for it, are you a realist if you believe the treatment of women affects the security, stability, governance, resilience, health, wealth, demography, education, and social progress of a nation? And are you a realist if you believe that women, peace, and security is actually a valid perspective? But more importantly, can you call yourself a national security realist if you reject these findings? Oh, yeah. That's where the conversations really begin, is at that point. So I'm going to end there because I know I've probably overshot everything I should have shot. But I'll leave you on this note. Over the many, many years, oh my gosh, I'm old now. Yes, over the many, many years that I've studied these issues, I have become convinced that there cannot be peace between nations until there is peace between men and women, and that the roots of many things we value, such as democracy and human rights, are to be found in the character of societal relations between men and women, the two halves of humankind. And if you'd like to go see our database, you go find it at womenstats.org and play around with it and have fun. I apologize for taking a little more time than I should have.
I'm seriously blown away and so grateful that you would be here today and would help us understand some of these issues. And I know people are probably dying to ask so many questions. I have myself so many running through my head. But well, so one of my questions, because we do work with government leaders around the world, faith-based leaders, community influencers, is when you educate them on this, what's next? How can they make a difference in addressing gender gap issues?
Oh, do I have a mic? Oh, okay, great. Oh, that's a marvelous question, and I want to start with it backwards, which is that, and I was just talking with someone in the break about this, is I think we often see promoting women's rights as being, for example, anti-religion. Yes. And I don't see that it has to be that way at all. I think we also think of feminism as opposed to any sort of nationalist project. And I don't think that necessarily has to be at all. In fact, I think part of what has to happen is we begin to break this stuff down and say, tell me your vision for what your country looks like, or tell me your vision for what your religion looks like. And I have a feeling, that the situation of women matters tremendously. So working, yes, I know there are conflicts in both of these areas, but working to find that common ground so that people don't look at feminists as if they're some sort of traitors to their country or traitors to their religion, I think is extremely important, absolutely important. I think, and again, like Dr. Benoon, I can't give you everything, but I will say, as I think Lou said, that sometimes it's got to be, in fact, a lot of the times, it's got to be men talking to men about why this matters, why it's important, why it's advantageous, why it's not a pet rock, right? I think that's really important. And then I think there are some top-down things that can happen. For example, the president of Tunisia has said, I believe women should have the same inheritance rights as men. Yeah, he can say that, and he's not killed for it. They may not vote him in, but, he's not killed for it. So I think men, especially men in power, have the opportunity to change things in a way that others will not. In fact, in one of my books, I call this the dictator's paradox, which is some of the most important advancements for women have come in autocratic nations. Because the leader can say, that's just the way it is. We're outlawing female genital cutting in Egypt. That's just the way it is. You don't like it? Tough, right? I'll arrest you. That's extremely important. But to be honest with you, while we can change some things structurally, top down, obviously it's got to come from each little household, doesn't it? Showing the male and female children within that household how males and females are to relate to one another and why relating in love and respect creates not just a better home, but a more prosperous home, a healthier home, a more educated home, and that can be done.
I love that. Thank you so much. Speaking to that, if I'm a woman in a home where there's a gender gap, whether it's here in the United States or in sub-Saharan Africa, how do I start to have that conversation? Because you're saying it's husband and wife, male and female, talking to their children about this. But what if it's my spouse that I need to convince first that our family situation will improve if he treats me better?
Well, it's different for an Afghan woman than it is for a U.S. woman. And every year I teach the foundational course in Women, Peace, and Security. It's called Women and Nations. And in the final course, I tell them that one of the most important feminist acts that they can commit is to marry well to marry someone who will treat them as an equal, because then you have an example for that next generation that they will be bringing forth of exactly how it can be done and why it's not difficult. It may be hard sometimes, but it actually isn't difficult to love each other. It isn't difficult to respect each other, and that everything turns out so much better. But for the Afghan woman, that's a completely different kettle of fish, isn't it? Right? And there, all I can suggest is, well, actually, in the first political order, we have some suggestions, is who was it who was speaking about, oh, it was, no, I can't remember who it was, but that man in the Peace Corps that was going around and teaching imams about why it's important to respect women. You need male authority figures telling husbands why this is important. And you can get some change that way. Will it be a lot of change? No, because frankly, men benefit so much from the subjugation of women in the short term. But in the longer term and in the larger picture, men are cursed as well by this system. But if you can get a man to see that larger picture and then raise his sons and his daughters differently. Did you hear, again, Dr. Benoon talk about how her father educated half the daughters as well as half the sons? What a revolutionary act that was. Every person in every household is capable of such revolutionary acts.
That's beautiful. And I love the fact that if children are taught in the home that way, it takes one generation.
Yes.
One generation to make a significant change. There are 1,000 more questions that I want to ask, and I feel really selfish right now with your time. So I'm hoping that you'll promise that you and I can get together and can answer some. And I'm going to open it up to the audience. We've been given just a few more minutes, so I'd love to get through as many questions as we can. So I'm going to ask you to please start with the question. Be concise, and let's hear the answer so that we can get to as many questions as possible. We'll go for about 8 minutes if we can do that. Question number 1.
As a lesbian feminist Christian pastor, thank you. Not all feminists are anti. The question would be, so I'm also an instructor who teaches gender studies. How do we get women to stop putting up with it?
Oh,
I know that should go on for next hour.
That's such a brilliant
I mean,
question.
right? I mean, we can convince all the men in the world, but we have to start with women saying, "I'm worth being loved and cherished, and not abused, and all those things." How do we do that for women? And how do women in the room do that for other women? $64 question.
Do you want me to answer? Oh, I'm so glad for that question. I've been at this for decades now. And when I was young, I was first like, if only we could get the men to wake up to this larger picture of national security, blah, 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 it's all going to change. Yeah, and then I discovered that men benefit so much in the short term that, But I then spent nights weeping to discover the women who not only put up with it, but the women who colluded with it. And those are the cases that break your heart. Who's killing baby daughters in India? It's not their fathers. It's their mothers and their grandmothers who are killing them. How is it that those women were raised with such internalized misogyny that they loathe their very daughter because she's the same sex that they are? These are deep mysteries of the heart. But all I can say is that you've got to light that candle in that pitch darkness. You've got to have examples of husbands and wives who do love each other, of parents who accepted 4 girls in India and educated them all, and then they go on to brilliant careers. And the only thing we can do is to show them that there is a different story, and it's a better story. It's a better story. But thank you for that question. It's caused me many nights of tears.
Thank you. Another question?
So I don't cry very often, which is not good, but you just made me appreciate all the more the relationship that my father and mother had as first immigration immigrants from Italy. Maybe it's because both of their fathers had died at early ages and they grew up in a maternal family that the mother kind of had to pull it all together, and they respected her immensely. And my question is, why? Why do men, your question about why would women put up with this? In my house, we were empowered, so I am just blown away at how I was gifted with such a wonderful family. But why are men not more likely to see why this benefits them in their family, in their state, in their country, in the planet? Is it a narcissistic thing? What is driving men to be so self-centered and women to be complicit in that while we're destroying each other? What is that fundamental thing that even the littlest insects that work together do not adapt, let alone the other mammals? What is it? Why?
Well, that's a beautiful question, and gosh, all of you are running deep today with me. First of all, I've got to say, my grandparents were Italian and came over on the boat through Ellis Island, so paisana. But, all right, I'm not going to give you a complete answer. I'm just going to give you what I think, is that I think, and it makes me very sad, because there are plenty of men who are not like this, and one of them is sitting right here, my husband. But I think for most men, the quest and journey of their life is to gain status in the hierarchy and world of men. And anything that would distract their vision from rising in the hierarchy of men is not something that they're prepared to spend any time on. And I think that's an incomplete answer, because when you see that wife in front of your eyes, you look into her eyes, how could you possibly be selfish? How could you hit her? How could you withhold, resources from her? I still don't get it. But I do think, some of you have sat in committee meetings where as the woman, that the game that's being played is not about the question your committee is supposed to talk about, is it? It's about which man rises through his jokes, his witty comment, his insight, his rebuttal, right? It's actually the joust among men that's happening there at the committee table. And the question that you were all tasked to deal with is actually secondary. It may not be even given very much thought. The wittiest man will have his will that is, applauded by everyone else in terms of the question. So somehow, you either have to turn men from looking at the hierarchy of men as the most important thing in their lives, or the hierarchy of men has got to be based on how well they treat women. And then how well they treat women becomes a status marker among men. My second is the daydream, because I have never seen a status hierarchy among men based on how well they treat women. But I think perhaps within religious communities, maybe that's a possibility. I like to think it's a possibility for my own faith community. I don't know if it will work out that way.
Wouldn't that be amazing? The vision needs to be put out there, right? Men act as they've seen, what's been modeled to them. And I think maybe that leads just to one more quick question before we have to close. But it sounds like talking about this, helping people see a better way, might be a path forward. What can you say to our audience members here today? What can they do today when they go home to start affecting change in this area, in their homes, in their communities, and even abroad?
Ask the organizers for my slide deck and sit down and have a conversation in your family, right? I mean, if we never talk about these things, no one can repudiate things that they've thought or said, and no one can make goals about better things to do. Right? I don't know how to do it except by showing what there is to see, making it uninvisible rather than invisible.